Kia ora, and welcome to Aotearoa's Opportunity, a podcast where we talk about fair pay agreements and how they can help us tackle some of Aotearoa's most urgent issues.
In this podcast, everyday workers will be sharing their stories about the issues that they deal with in their industries and how we can discuss solutions that FPAs will have to offer.
So, no mai, haere mai, and welcome to Aotearoa's Opportunity.
One of the things I've researched is waterfront workers, who used to be an incredibly powerful union when everything came in and out by ship. And they had very high levels of membership activism, and partly that was that everyone came along to a meeting and discussed how things were going to go. But they also organised heaps of other things as well, like they had their own brass band, and they had a debating club, and they had a picnic that they took the children to, and all those sorts of things. In as many different forums as possible, people are coming together and talking about their work and talking about how they're going to improve it, and not kind of treating this whole thing as a process that is happening to them, but taking active involvement. That'll make a difference.
It's something I often talk to working people or stuff. You'll have someone, if there's a workplace and maybe a few senior people have been there a while, have some perks, and that's good. You should develop in, if you stay in a supermarket or a hospo workplace or something for a long time and the boss gives you a little bit extra, then that's positive. But then those people often, if you're doing negotiations and you're saying, well, raising the pay rates for everyone, they'll be like, oh, well, what about them? Why are they getting, an increase and they're just newer, or what about, me? And that's, yeah, it's true. People should have more, but the only way to defend that and to protect that is to make sure everyone's getting looked after, and that actually looking after yourself is a surefire way of undermining that. Because what we tend to see is that thing of like the worst conditions are the ones that are most contagious. Welcome to the Aotearoa's Opportunity podcast. In today's episode, we're looking at history, where we've come from, why employment looks the way it does, have unions always existed, or has work always just been like this? There's some really interesting stuff to think about. Change happens. Change can be big, change can be small, but change is always happening, and what we do affects the way the future will look. And understanding the past and understanding the way things have been can give us a really interesting map and insight into the way things could be. Today we're talking to Grace Miller, who's been an activist in the union movement, been an academic and been involved in the Labour History Project, about some of the things that New Zealand work has seen, the changes that working people have been able to achieve over the last 200 years, and what that might mean for the future. For fair pay agreements, this is important because this is a new mechanism, but it's built on some of the stuff that has existed in the past. We have had industry bargaining and sector bargaining in the past that led to really important improvements for working people, and that went away in a very specific time and really undermined a lot of the work that we do in New Zealand. Understanding those mechanisms, looking to lessons from them, is a really important part of making the most out of this opportunity that are fair pay agreements and building strong workers' organisations today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy the episode, please make sure you subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues, get the word out, because the more people who participate and understand fair pay agreements, the stronger we'll be to get the most out of it. We hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks. Good morning, Grace.
Morning, and I'd just like to say that I am here in my own capacity as a historian, and anything I say is not necessarily the opinion of the PSA.
Cool, so thanks for joining us today. To start off, what motivates your interest in union history?
The reason I'm interested in union history is because I think it gives a sense of what is possible, and I think that it can be really easy to get depressed either about like the rate of change or the things that aren't changing. And if you look back, you can see both that things have changed in incredible ways, but also that change isn't necessarily linear and things have also got worse. And I think from particularly union history, it's really important to hold on to both of those things, that unions have managed to do incredible things, but also that there were ways that work used to be better in the past than it is now. And I think it's very easy when you kind of go out into the world to think that the way that things are now is inevitable and there's no other way that things could be. And if you want to understand that that's not true, and if you want to understand how we got here, the good bits and the bad, how we got both incredible victories, and also why people have so much insecure work and why wages are low, you actually have to look at that really long history. And the idea, and the other part of it, is that history really gives you a sense that what you do matters, and that you can look at what people have done in the past and say, oh, look, they did something that had this impact, and they didn't know they were even going to have this impact, and maybe they didn't really understand the impact that they have, but that's the reason that I have access to, being paid the same as a man, like that all these things are, that combination of understanding that it's not, that the way things are isn't set in stone and they can be changed, and therefore what you do matters. I think that history is a very powerful way of getting to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when did unions start in New Zealand? Where did this if we go
right back. Yeah. Well, I mean, the important thing to understand is that unions are basically only happen because we have what you call a wage labour economy. So unions are a response to an economy that says, if for most people, unless you have, unless you own something big that will give you money, that you have to work in order to live. And that was brought to New Zealand in 1840 by the New Zealand Company, which is, was the beginning, when New Zealand first became settled by Pākehā. They were very explicit, and not just in a, the New Zealand Company is a very interesting thing to explore, but their goal was to set up colonies in New Zealand, and they were very explicit that they needed to make sure that there were enough people to do work. There were enough people who needed to do work so that the richer people could have people who would do work for them, and so that was very much. It wasn't like just random. It wasn't a coincidence. It was very much that is the idea that we are setting up New Zealand with, but as well as the idea of wage labour being the organising system of New Zealand, coming to New Zealand in 1840. The idea that workers could get together and resist also came to New Zealand in 1840, and it came on the very same ships because in the UK, where people had been coming from, there had been this history of people coming together in unions. It wasn't very well developed, and not very long before people came to New Zealand, people from the UK, you could still get. It was still considered like a criminal offence to organise a union, but the idea that if you got together with people around you and said, no, we won't accept these conditions, that came to New Zealand from very early on. So on I think it's the 9th of February, so we're 1840, so we're right after Waitangi Day. Samuel Parnell gets off a ship in Petone, that was before that was before the Wellington capital had moved to Thorndon, when they were still trying to build Wellington on the Hutt River. And Samuel Parnell got off, and someone asked him to build there. Someone rich whose name has not been saved by history. But someone asked him to work to build a house. And he said, I will, but only if I can only work an 8-hour day. And he talked to all the other carpenters who were on the ship, because he knew them, because they'd been on the ship together. And he says, here in New Zealand, we only work an 8-hour day. And that because he had come here with dreams of a better world, and the complicated dynamics of settler New Zealand is we don't have time to go on all of that. But the idea that people came here and they said, they knew that if they got together with the people around them, they could demand better working conditions. That was in New Zealand from the very first settler or the second or third settlership, and there's a really good book called by Jared Davidson called History of a Riot, which looks at early worker activism and people saying no in Nelson in 1843. So that idea that basically both the idea that you needed to work, because obviously that hadn't been the idea in New Zealand, the idea that you needed to do a waged work, that hadn't been the predominant economic model that because people survived because they were part of iwi and they were part of hapa and they were part of groups in Māori culture, and that idea that individually you needed to do wage work in order to survive, that was something that came with the settler economy, but also the strongest way of resisting that came at the same time. So they both have this long history in New Zealand, but initially it was quite sporadic and it wasn't very organised, and there weren't huge structures of unions, and it wasn't until about 1870 that more strongly structured unions began to develop.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting sort of thing about New Zealand's, that this is something that started from the first people of that. It was really contested, but also I think it helps to think about unions, and it really shows what unions are as working sort of people things, as organisations for working people. Mm-hmm. So it's not that there was a union organiser didn't get off a boat and start building institutions, but working people got together. So now we've got very institutionalised things. Mm-hmm. We're talking about fair pay agreements as this very regulated sort of process, but in the fundamental thing, what is unions is a few carpenters getting together and saying, actually would like to work a shorter day. Yeah, cool. So they've been around since the very start of New Zealand's colonial history. What sort of impact have unions had on life in New Zealand?
It's such a big question, because you could pick almost anything and say that that unions contributed to that. I mean, the first and the most obvious one is like weekends, and that's it's almost a joke. People have a bumper sticker that says, weekends brought to you by unions, but it's genuinely true that the idea that, and obviously not everybody gets weekends off, but the cultural idea that you get weekends off, that didn't come, that wasn't in 1840 in that idea. Samuel Parnell may have fought for an 8-hour day, but he probably worked Saturday as well. The idea that you get 2 days off every week, and that is something that, if not everybody gets access to that, but that is something that we should aim for. That came about as a result of a really long union struggle, and that for the first almost 100 years in New Zealand, most people would have worked Saturday. Most people who are in paid work would have worked on a Saturday, and that was sort of part of the normal week. And it wasn't until the 1930s that the idea that that you kind of slowly, bit by bit, and it wasn't quick and it wasn't immediate, but unions were like, okay, we'll get a half day on Saturday, so then people worked 5.5 days, and then it was like, okay, in the 1930s it was a 5.5 day. They managed to get it down to a 5-day week for everybody except shop workers. Shop workers still had to work the half day on Saturday, and so it wasn't until immediately after the war that the idea, and it was that period, a few decades after the war, where shop workers did get Saturdays as well, alongside everyone else. And then obviously some of that's been undone, and now shop workers don't necessarily get Saturdays, depending on the shop. But that's the whole point, is that the idea that we have a weekend is an idea that has been built up, and that is something that exists, and that's something that people should have access to. It's something that's been built up over time, and unions were the people who made sure that happened. A couple of other things that I would say, pay equity is a huge one. One of the ideas that came with those ships, alongside the idea of wage labour, was the idea that women's work was worth less than men, and until 1960 in the private sector, in 1972 in the 1960 in the public sector, 1972 in the private sector, it would be completely legal if we were working the same job It wouldn't be just legal, it would be standard and expected that you would be paid more than me. And so that, and I think, again, that's another example where there was a massive step forward made when it was like, no, you can't pay women less than men. You can't have a women's rate. You can't have a girls' room. You can't have, like, even that was a massive step forward. But now there's lots of different steps. So first you say, okay, no, women and men who are doing the same job, they can't be paid different rates. But then later on you say, okay, just because women have tended to do childcare and doesn't mean it's worth less. So that whole process of saying, actually, women's work is as important and as valuable as men's is something that we've kind of dragging and constantly trying to do, and it's not like we've achieved it, just like the weekend and everyone getting sufficient time off. We haven't achieved all these things, but like if you look back at where you started from, we've come so far. And I think that again, that's why it's really useful to have a sense of the history, because you can get very frustrated, and I do get very frustrated with pay equity. It's like, why does it take so much? Why all this sort of stuff? But then if you take a look back and you realise that people, exactly how much effort it took just to get to where we are now, and that's a reason to keep on pushing in, not to get disparaged, because that's how you can get somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing when you look at it, of simultaneously like huge changes and then also very slow change, because the 70s is not that long ago. And so it's quite frightening to think of that, our parents, would have been or grandparents, depending on how old you are, like worked in a time where that was a reasonable and expected sort of thing that,
And it's one of the reasons, this is a sidetrack, but it's one of the reasons I get really annoyed by like boomer discourse, because people, I'm like, oh, you're only thinking about men. Like, if people are imagining that like women who were born in the 1950s, they started their work being paid substantially less than men, like the idea that was some sort of easily to navigate, a world just really frustrates me, because it loses how much we've won and how much, we shouldn't take for granted the things we've won, even though, some things have got much worse.
Yeah, and things things change, and that's I think the exciting thing for a lot of people, and that sense. I think it often feels in the world today that things aren't changing, or or it's impossible, but they have, and it will change again. And so we're talking about this podcast. We're talking about fair pay agreements, and we've got episodes that look into that in more detail. But to really simplify it, there are a sector bargaining approach that cover workers in whole sectors or industries or occupations. Has this kind of sector bargaining existed before in New Zealand?
Yeah. So yes, it has. So in the 1890s, a new system of bargaining was set up called the award system, and that existed for almost 100 years, from the 1890s to the 1990s. And so anyone who started work before 1990, this was their first experience of work, was that there was an award that covered their work. And the award system worked in lots of different ways. And there was a lot. It was 100 years, so obviously it changed a lot. But the basic idea was that when you went into a job, say your first job, say you're working in a supermarket or other retail, you go into that job, and there's a rate that covers. There's an award that covers everyone who works in that job, and so that covers your wages, but it also covers so there's a level at which you can't go below, but it also covers things that might be specific to your job. So it covers if you work late nights, it'll cover maybe rates for that, and if you it'll cover breaks. It means that there's a minimum conditions that everybody who works in a particular industry has to have. And this is a slightly different example, but it's particularly useful for people who aren't working in big groups. So bus drivers generally work in big groups, right? So they manage to keep their unions throughout the whole time. But if you think about people who are relatively isolated, like say a care and support worker or a clerical worker, If you're the only clerical worker in a business, if you're the only admin worker, they used to be called clerical workers, now they're called admin workers. If you're the only clerical worker in a business, then it'd be really easy for you to kind of be driven down, your standards to be driven down, because you don't have much power. So, but this said, actually, we will say what clerical workers, and then quite isolated workers like care and support workers. If you have something that covers everybody, then again, they can't. It offers protection, and it means they can't compete on price by driving down prices. The other thing to say that these awards rates were always the minimum, so it didn't stop people from negotiating more, but it made sure that there was a floor in what people were paid and what the conditions were, and so people's first, this is true, people's first experience of work would be having some sort of basic protection. I think one of the problems, well, there's lots of problems with the current employment system, and this is one of them, but like one of the things that really screws people over is that a lot of the first experiences of work that people have are because you're quite isolated. They're kind of casual work. They're likely to be the sort of work where you tend to be quite exploited. And so that kind of sets people up for expecting work to be quite exploitative. And so if your first experience of work is in a place where it's like, actually there are minimum terms and conditions, it gives you a better idea of what to do. And the really interesting thing about awards, they've done something really cool, which is they've digitized all the old awards. I mean, shows how nerdy I am, but anyway, I think it's cool. But they've digitized all the old awards. So I'll send you a link, and you can put it in if there's any notes that go with this. But what it means is you can go and you can look and you can see what you would have been paid if you were doing the job in 1976 or 1966 or 1986, and what generally, as well as if you go back to 1966, you'll probably see unequal pay rates for men and women, but you will also, what you'll generally see is the wages will seem really low because wages were lower then, but the conditions will often be much better, and there'll be heaps more sort of protective conditions around things like overtime and things like that, and hours of work and more guaranteed hours of work. So all those conditions which have kind of totally been driven down. It's a really good way to see like what could be possible for work like yours. If you're like, if your employer says, we can only do it in this way where we don't guarantee you hours and we don't pay overtime and we don't do any of these things. If you go and you look at the award, you can see that actually there was a time when people were offered these conditions, and so that's
and it exists in Australia and stuff. A lot of these systems have maintained in other places, and maybe we'll include in the notes as well the Australian sort of system as well, so people can have a look, because it's quite common actually to have these things, and and things like allowances and stuff. So if you in a lot of things you'll see like wet or unpleasant work allowances and stuff. So if you come into work in a fast food restaurant and someone's done terrible things in the bathroom, which happens more than you think in fast food restaurants, unfortunately, if you're the person who pulls the lucky straw and has to sort of deal with that, then maybe in other systems you have an allowance to recognise that you've gone above and beyond. We've removed those sort of things. So New Zealand used to have a sector bargaining approach in the awards. What happened to the sector bargaining, and how did that impact working people when it went away?
The sector bargaining approach in New Zealand was destroyed in 1991 in a very extreme way. Like overnight, New Zealand went from this very kind of full award system, but in 1990 a new national government was elected. And one of the things they decided to do was completely destroy the current employment protections and systems. And they passed the Employment Contracts Act, which was like a radical, completely new, swept away everything that had been gone before. And so you went from a system where in the different sectors where people worked, there were all these different protections and provisions. You went to like very, very few minimal conditions. So the minimal, it was something like, there was a minimum wage, you had an entitlement to 5 days sick leave. I don't think you had the entitlement to bereavement leave. at that point, and if you did, it had to come out of your 5 days sick leave. So it was 5 days sick leave and bereavement leave. You had 3 weeks annual leave, you had public holidays, but no right to time and a half on public holidays. There might have been one other provision, but that was so that was it. So there was no rights to redundancy, no rights of guaranteed hours, like all these sorts of things that had been that had been in place, just kind of got stripped away, and the mechanism for maintaining them also got stripped away. So rather than awards, it was all individual contracts, or you could have collective contracts. And so what happened was, there's a couple of things happened. One was it didn't affect everybody always straight away, because unions continued to be able to bargain in some places. In big workplaces, the award was basically turned into a collective agreement. So, for example, in some of the health unions now, you can still see traces of the old award in the collective agreements that still stand together. So in really big workplaces that were well unionised, they were able to protect some of those conditions. But in other places, particularly isolated workers, the result was that people got that the employer was basically able to strip away all the terms and conditions and say, no, you can't have all these things that you've guaranteed, and now if you want work, you have to have a pay cut, and you have to have you have to have less leave, and you can't have overtime. So it was particularly hours of work and overtime and wages and any sort of guarantee of work. Those were the things that were most likely that really got stripped out, and it had a huge impact. So one of the things about that time is that the pay gap between men and women actually fell. But it fell because men's wages were falling so fast, which is you don't want pay equity by any means necessary. You want pay equity on the you don't want men's wages to fall, but like wages fell so fast that like the pay gap, people would I once talked to a worker who left her job, in 1991, had kids, and then went back in like 1997, and she was offered wages that were less than she was being paid in 1991. And the other thing, which I think isn't talked about quite as much, but it's really important, is that, the 1990s, there's all these other changes happening, like changes in technology and changes in computers are coming in, and they're lots of work starts changing because of the changes in technology. But all these changes happen at a time where unions have less power, and so workers have less say on how their work is being changed by technology. And so it means that kind of all the technology that's come in, there's been it hasn't been, often it's being used, it can be used for surveillance, or it can just really cut out people's ability to use it to, it's not like what will most enable us to, if you're thinking, do make life easier for the workers. How can this technology make work easy, and how can this technology be used in a way that actually makes things better for the people who are doing the work, but instead, how can the technology be used in a way that cuts profits and those sorts of things? So basically, there were all these immediate effects, but it also means that all the work that we've experienced, all the changes we've experienced for the last 30 years, they've all happened with much less say, and that's if you go down, that's how you get things like Uber and Uber Eats and those sorts of things, which are just done in a way which is all by algorithm and there's sort of this path. Whereas you could imagine a way that the communication technology could be used in a way that makes work more secure for workers, but instead it's being made less secure.
Yeah, and it's so many of our experiences of work sort of stem from this reality now, and issues we deal with. Like, I think a lot about Australia and that pay gap between New Zealand and Australia. I'm from Australia. I'm not sure if the accent comes through on this or not, but a lot of people, especially young people, especially if you've got a trade or qualification, go to Oz because the wages are significantly better. And it's not because Australians work any harder, and I can tell you for a fact it's not because bosses are nicer in Australia. It's that they've got an award system which has maintained these sort of protections, and it means there's this huge gap. And that's, we don't have that, and we see that sort of that gap, and means people are punished for staying here. Really, like it's no good. It's
And you see that, like, basically, this is probably getting a bit nerdy, but like that New Zealand has basically, because we have so few fixing devices, and because the structure doesn't allow it much sectoral bargaining. Like, you can have mechas, but there's huge limits on that. What you end up is that the things that we do have end up being used in this very, like, the minimum wage is the only way to get wages up. And so, like, New Zealand, there's the minimum wage and the median wage is closer in New Zealand than anywhere else, because employers are just like, I won't pay any more than the minimum wage. There's so many employers who won't pay any more than the minimum wage. And that means that it means that they don't invest in technology, because it's actually, if you're paying people really low, it's cheaper to pay them to invest in technology. So there's all this, like, a lot of what people say is like productivity, and when all that economist stuff, like, a lot of it comes back to the fact that, like, workers don't have enough power.
Fair pay agreements are a new thing, but they build on stuff that has existed in the past, and would go some way to remove some of these issues that exist that were inherited from the 90s. Yeah,
so fair pay agreements are new, and they are not the same as the award system, and but they will offer a way to get some kind of sectoral agreement about minimums, and there will be obviously it's super important in things like contracting out. So it's really important for cleaners, it's really important for bus drivers, it's really important for care and support workers, it's really important for the sort of workers who are being where their employer is trying to compete on price and driving down wages, and it will hopefully be a way to build up some of those conditions that make sure that people can improve their conditions, in places of work. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity. It's like for so long, like, any kind of bargaining has had to happen on a workplace level, or there's been very limited ability to bring people together. And if in cross-sectoral multi-employer collective agreements, but if you can say, so that, as long as that's true, as long as someone can always set up a new thing and pay their employees less and compete, in the economic system that we exist under, there's always going to be a motivation to do that. And so that's why sectoral bargaining is such a powerful way of, what unions can and should do is go and try and organise in that new place and bring them up. But yeah, that's why it's such a powerful way of organising.
Cool. So a lot of what we're talking about through different mechanisms or history is worker voice and strong unions are strong workers is better working life. What is the preconditions, or what builds, from your research as a historian, what builds strong workers and strong unions?
Well, I'd say to build a strong union, the first thing you need is that people need to be involved, right? Like that the member, members are the union, and the more active people are, the more that they take part in the union, the more that you kind of go along to talk with current workers, do the equivalent of what Samuel Parnell was doing in 1840 and say, actually, how do we feel like that? The stronger the union will be. And so part of my research was about, one of the things I've researched is waterfront workers, who used to be an incredibly powerful union when everything came in and out by ship. And they had very high levels of membership activism, and partly that was that everyone came along to a meeting and discussed how things were going to go. But they also organised heaps of other things as well. Like they had their own brass band, and they had a debating club, and they had a picnic that they took the children to and all those sorts of things. And obviously that's not necessarily, the fact that they had that in the 1950s isn't necessarily going to kind of translate to today, but the idea that in as many different forums as possible, people are coming together and talking about their work and talking about how they're going to improve it, and not kind of treating this whole thing as a process that is happening to them, but taking active involvement, that'll make a difference. And that's the thing, like, even if you're like, oh, my union's not very active, there's not a lot happening in my workplace, like, there's something that you can do about that. There's something that you can there's something that you can change. You can just go and talk to the people next to you, and you can figure out and the experience. The thing is, like, if you experience a victory in your workplace, like, even if it's really small, even if it's like, what is the thing that people want to change? If you can get together and you can say, we're going to try and change that, and you experience that, then that'll give people heaps of, that really changes the feeling of power. So that's, the biggest thing for a strong union is that people are, is the level of activism. But the other thing that is so important is solidarity. Like, and it's so important to be able to, because even the strongest union, if you're very strong and everyone's very active if you only think about people who are in the union and not people who are outside the union, or you exclude people, then you end up being vulnerable, because, to give an example, there are times in the New Zealand where the New Zealand union movement, I'm thinking, took a particularly actively hostile position towards immigrants, particularly non-white immigrants, and wouldn't allow them in the union, and saw non-white immigrants as being like a challenge to the union. And that left them really vulnerable, because if you say to people, no, you can't be part of the union, they'll say, okay, well, I don't have to respect your work. And they'll be all like, I'll work for less. And you end up undermining the union. And what's really important is to not just look at your one workplace or the workers who are like you, but say, it's the old principle, an injury to one is an injury to all. And a positive example of that is like in 1960, the public service, the PSA won pay equity in the public service. And it was a really big struggle, but it meant that in the public service, women were paid the same as men. But still in the private sector, there was still this big gap, and it was still a legal gap. And the PSA wasn't like, oh, well, we've won pay equity, therefore we're gonna like just leave everybody else. They were like really, really central, and put a lot of resources into the group that ended up campaigning and winning pay equity for everyone 12 years later. And if they hadn't done that, if they'd just been all like, oh, well, we'll just keep pay equity in the private sector, in the public sector, because that's all that matters to us, then it would have been vulnerable, right? Because eventually a government could have said, actually, this is bullshit. Why are we paying women the same as men when no one else is? We can get away with not doing that, so we'll do that. So you will always, if you're not acting in solidarity, you're always vulnerable. And so that those two combinations of building strong relationships and workplace relationships and activism where you are, but also reaching out and making sure that you understand that if there are people who are experiencing worse conditions than you, and who are experiencing worse, that you need to extend out solidarity, because otherwise there's every chance that your conditions could be brought down to them. So you need to have to fight to bring their conditions up to yours.
Yeah. It's something I often talk to working people or stuff. You'll have someone, if there's a workplace and maybe a few senior people have been there a while, have some perks, and that's good. You should develop in, if you stay in a supermarket or a hospo workplace or something for a long time, and the boss gives you a little bit extra, then that's positive. But then those people often, if you're doing negotiations and you're saying, well, raising the pay rates for everyone, they'll be like, oh, well, what about them? Why are they getting, an increase and they're just newer, or what about, me? And that's, it's true. People should have more, but the only way to defend that and to protect that is to make sure everyone's getting looked after, and that actually, if you're getting something, the only way to secure that is to make sure that everyone gets it. It's not, looking after yourself is a surefire way of undermining that, because what we tend to see is that thing of like the worst conditions are the ones that are most contagious in a natural sort of way. So if someone's been accepting minimum wage and terrible hours, then at some point that will come for you if you're not actively trying to help them out.
Yeah, the other example, just in terms of strong union, topical example, which I just think is worth including there, is in America, they've just had a massive, incredible victory of the people who write films and television, called the Writers Guild. And if you look at their conditions, it's like they basically have got everything they put down, everything they were going for. And you can think, oh, well, some of them are incredibly well paid, but not everybody who works on, what they were fighting for is they were fighting because the streaming economy has changed the way they're paid, and they were fighting to keep that they could keep on making a living even though the streaming economy has changed. And so you can think, oh, well, they have all these advantages because the actors are on strike as well, and they're all really famous, and they write they write these television shows that everyone thinks is amazing, and therefore they have all these advantages. But if you look at it, what actually made the difference was that they were incredibly active. So all these, they did an incredible job of mobilising people and mobilising the vote, and everybody went out on the picket lines, and there were writers in New Zealand who were like, I'm doing my little bit because I'm a member of this guild. And the other thing is because Hollywood unions, sometimes they fight against each other, and they did a really good job of making sure that all the different unions were, except for the Directors Guild, but we won't talk about that, they did a really good job of keeping the unions together. And so it's those two things, and so don't be fooled. If you read about that, don't be fooled to think it's not relevant to you, or, or that it's something, that there's some sort of, it's because that they are working in an industry that's really different from you that they got this amazing victory. Actually, it was because of those two principles of active union and solidarity.
Absolutely. Have New Zealand unions, we've talked a lot about workplace issues and stuff, although some of it gets into social issues around, gender and stuff. But are New Zealand unions, or is unionism restricted to workplace issues, or historically have we seen, going beyond that as well? You could
put it, you could look at it either way, right? You could either say, no, unions, when you have a strong union, it goes beyond, it can go beyond their workplace. Or you can say, actually, most issues are workplace issue. If you have a broad enough definition of solidarity, any issue is a workplace issue. So to give an example, which I researched relatively recently, and I think is really powerful. New Zealand, until 1986, again, talking about terrifying things, this is my lifetime. Until 1986, it was illegal for men to have sex with each other in New Zealand. It was a criminal offence. Homosexual law reform. But anyway, and I recently read the PSA submission to homosexual law reform, and what it basically said was, one of our basic principles is that all members need to be treated equally, and they needed to be treated justly. And we cannot defend members who are being harassed at work because they are gay if men having sex with men is illegal. It gets in the way of... We're promoting equity in the workplace, and this law criminalising gets in the way of that. And there was quite a long submission that was very clear that that the PSA supported homosexual law reform, and did so by starting at the workplace, by starting at the impact that because gay men are workers, therefore it has an impact on the workplace, therefore it has an impact on unions, and therefore we need to stand in solidarity. And so there's sort of that way of that most issues come into the workplace one way or another, and have kind of been fought, and unions have fought them in the workplace and supported fighting them elsewhere. So just to give a few other examples, the waterfront workers that I mentioned, before Waitangi Day was a public holiday, they used to go on strike every Waitangi Day because they thought that it should be a public holiday, and then they thought that it should be that Te Tiriti should be recognised, that was an early example of unions doing that. So unions, because work is so central to society, unions have a lot of power, and sort of the really big example is when unions say, actually, I won't do that work because I think that work is immoral, and there's a lot of examples of that. again, you can get examples of people refusing to go right back to, immediately before World War II, saying we won't load ships that are going to fascist regimes and things like that. There's lots of sort of examples of those sorts of things. And the biggest example in New Zealand, and the most famous example in New Zealand, is Bastion Point, which was a massive Māori occupation, where Māori, the land had been taken off Māori, and there'd been a long history of, both of Māori resistance to this land being taken off, and also union support that went all the way back to the 1940s. But in the 1970s, Muldoon, who was the government, who was in power at the time, wanted to sell this land to make rich people's houses, and there was a big occupation, and the union supported this occupation, and the electricity board workers and the concrete workers and the drivers, they all said, we will not work. We will not do this work. We will not string up electricity to these new houses, and we will not lay the roads, and we will not drive the materials there. And so that along was a really important support of the occupation, and was part of what allowed, that support was a really important thing to what was an eventual victory about 10 years later. And so that's like the ultimate, and I think it's really relevant at the moment, right? Like, we think about climate change and it can feel like we're powerless, but one of the things that workers can do is organising their work, like a lot of emissions take place at work, and so saying, actually, is this work going to leave us on a burning dead planet? And if so, maybe we organise not to do it, or maybe we say we want to do it in a different way, or, you make those sorts of demands. That there is, that's what kind of, again, it gives you hope, because at the moment, for a lot of people, I would say, a lot of people, it seems impossible. You're fighting for such not little, but you're fighting for such basic things in your workplace, like security of hours and all that kind of stuff. And to be at the level of strength where you could say, actually, I want to say over what sort of work that I can do, that seems like impossible. But it's actually, if you build a strong unions traditionally, or historically, not traditionally, that makes it sound like it's set in stone, but historically, when you have a strong union, you have been able to have some say in your work. And that idea that you can have a say in all those things, that you can have an impact, is, I think, again, it's why history is really important, because it makes you see that, like, unions can be this place, because work affects everything. Work is so central, and nothing happens without work. But if you have well-organised workers, then you can have this huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to bring things back to the fair pay agreement sort of process and stuff, there is avenues to talk about some of this stuff, like health and safety is something that must be discussed and raised through the fair pay agreement process, and many, many thousands of people have dealt with the impacts of the floods and cyclones and stuff that we've had here that are related to climate change. There's very real avenues to start having that conversation, and we'll leave it to the dear listeners to determine whether that's something they want to raise with their unions and insist on being raised. But there's no barriers to us being creative in the FPA process and looking to raise some of these issues through that. To wrap us up, being a historian, having looked at these unions and sort of the unions past, do you have any thoughts on the future of unionism in New Zealand?
Well, I think one of the things about being a historian, is that you realise that there are always lots of possibilities for the future, and so, for example, one of the things that I've done, like, you go and you read these documents in the archives, and they say, things are really bad and we're not really having any impact, and I don't think that this is possible. And because you've studied the movement, that actually that this was a really crucial time and they made an amazing impact. And so, it feels like at the moment that that there is huge possibilities in terms of increased unionisation. Like worldwide, we're seeing some really big levels of increased organisation and increased industrial action and all those sorts of things. That we're in a time of real uncertainty, and that, so it could go either way, right? Like we could find that unions are like continue to, do really good work, but have to do that in this sort of sector, in this individual workplace way, and that limits their strength. Or we could have like sectoral bargaining, and that could lead to an increase in how we in worker strength. But I think like the important thing is like none of it is inevitable. Like none of it is set in stone. And like if things can seem right now, they can seem really fraught, and it can seem like things are going to get worse. Like the most important thing to remember is that what we do matters, and that we can add that actually we have an impact, and that the future of the union movement will be made by decisions that people make in their workplaces to talk with other people and to organise and to do all those things. And like one of the things that there are lots of reasons I study history, but the most important one is that you realise that there's always hope. Because you see times, and hope, the thing about hope is not certainty, right? Hope is not the idea that things are definitely going to happen or they're definitely going to be good. Because as a historian, you also hear just terrible things. Like I have talked to many people who were on strike for a year, who lost their wages for a year in a desperate battle to try and stop the sort of changes that happened here in New Zealand that we've been talking about with the Employment Contracts Act. And they lost. And I have seen the impact of that losing. So hope isn't the idea that you're definitely going to win. Hope is the possibility that things could be better. And hope, unlike despair or even like certainty that things are going to get better, hope demands that you act and that you can't afford. And it can be really tempting, and we all do it sometimes, to just feel like, oh, everything's terrible and I'm just going to give up to that. And there's nothing that I can do. But it's really important. And the reason I read history and I study history and I'm really interested in history is it's the best motivation against that. It's the best motivation that actually there are possibilities that things can get better. And that, that we do have this possibility of making things better. And so that's kind of that's kind of the last thing that I would say. I would say that in this moment there is a huge amount of hope, but that hope depends on what people do.
Thanks very much, Grace. That's a really great note to leave us on. And for people who would like to do something right now, then you can do something. What you do does matter in your workplace, and you can help us by sharing this podcast and getting that around. You can leave it a positive review, share the podcast with friends or colleagues. You can join your union or get active in your union. You can do a lot, and I look forward to hearing more podcasts in the future that talk about the great work that everyone did in the fair pay agreement process, inspired by this little podcast called Aotearoa's Opportunity. It's great. Thank you so much for coming on, Grace, and sharing with us. And thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Cool.
mua ngaro atu i te ao i te waituhi o te koanga anu anu e tu moke moke te totara